Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable, the only podcast that dares to be both on topic and in every location. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I am a part of the Gestalt IT network. I specialize in things like networking and security. And each episode, we bring you the perspectives of a group of very important luminaries in the IT industry. And we give them a premise, a topic, if you will, to debate and discuss. But we're always on premise. I'd like to take a moment for our guests to introduce themselves before we introduce the premise for this episode today, starting with Taryn.
Hey, Tom. Yeah, my name's Taryn Bryson. My Twitter handle is @someclown. I basically am a network engineer doing a lot of stuff with a lot of things and other stuff.
All right, Rita.
My name's Rita Younger. I'm SDN_girl on Twitter and also co-founder of TotalPackets.com. What I do for a living, though, what pays the bills, is I run a data center practice.
All right, and Ben.
Hi, Tom. My name is Ben Story. I'm a network security engineer, and you can find me on Twitter at NTWRK80.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into the premise for today's episode. I mentioned security in the opening. It's something that we have to deal with on a daily basis because, well, we need to stay safe. And one of the things that we've seen that happens quite frequently in the industry is that a piece of software that we use gets hacked. Maybe someone guesses a password, or in the event of something even larger, like we've seen with the SolarWinds breach from late 2020, there's more going on than meets the eye. But what happens after we've detected the breach? What happens when we figure out that something is amiss and we need to solve the problem? Do we shut everything down and take stock of what's going on? Or do we rip everything out and throw it all away and start over from scratch? I've seen both solutions, and I don't necessarily know that one is better than the other. So the premise for today's episode is, when we get hacked, do we have to rip it all out and throw it away? I'd like to actually start with Mr. Ben Story, because he's the one who brought this idea to us a little bit, and it's kind of related to the SolarWinds issues that we're starting to see. They're actually ongoing. Each week brings us a new twist in the tale. Ben, have you ever been in a situation where you've had a piece of software or one of your tools that's been compromised, and management told you you got to toss it out with the bathwater?
Actually, we definitely have. I mean, as a VAR, we are often asked by our customers, what do we do? What do we do? And we get different responses depending on their security postures. And it's been interesting because internally we debate between ourselves on, okay, do we tell them just to rip it out and replace it? Or do we tell them to shut it down, let's figure out what's going on? Or, what take do we go on? And with SolarWinds in particular, it's been quite contentious within our practice. We have like 2 or 3 of us that say, no, we can make this work. And there's another guy that it's time to rip it out. SolarWinds is dead to us. So yeah, it's definitely not an easy sell either direction.
I believe this really points out the lack of visibility in general that we have to what's actually taking place on the network. So sure, it's a very hard lesson, right? But it gives us an opportunity to shore things up, because security at the edge was never the solution. And if these 33,000 customers, if they actually had visibility, they may have noticed something going on.
That's a very good point. I definitely want to bring up that, yes, SolarWinds was the root cause in a lot of these hacks, but why are we allowing our network monitoring tools to talk directly to the internet without any sort of question as to what they're doing? Zero trust means zero trust, even to the network monitoring tool.
Well, and I think, one of the things that we see a lot is that network monitoring tools themselves don't get monitored, right? We have tools to monitor all of our network, different things. We have security tools. We have, we're looking at this, we're looking at that. But when we look at a big package from SolarWinds or, BMC or PRTG or whoever it might be that we're using for an NMS, it's sort of left on its own, whether it talks to the internet or not. And I think that's an issue.
Well, it also created a backdoor where they could get in with more threats. So I think that visibility is really important, but just like any type of virus protection, you need to know what is the good traffic on your network versus the bad traffic. So you really have to be, like you said, people don't necessarily use their network monitoring tools. But you need to have a full understanding. You need to know the application dependency mappings. You need to really understand those traffic patterns, and you need to fine tune it. So you're really qualifying what is good traffic, what is bad traffic. Because if it's crying wolf, we're just going to ignore it.
Yeah, and I will just toss out a quick defense of SolarWinds. This is coming from, I had the opportunity a few years ago to listen to General Keith Alexander speak live, and he of course was head of the NSA for some time, as well as having a past career in the military, obviously. And he made this point that when he was head of the NSA, if there was a target that the NSA wanted to get into, he said they got into it. No questions asked, 100% success rate. If they determined that they needed to get something, they got it. And they never had, they never had a failure of getting into, penetrating a target. He said, however, defense is extremely difficult. He said, even for an organization like the NSA or the US DOD or whatever in general, he said it's extremely difficult to block all threats. And I think so, the SolarWinds thing, it's like, sure, they're in the news, they got hacked. It's a big problem for a lot of people. But I think it's also, it could just as easily have been, any one of the other large software products that get used on our networks, day in, day out. I don't think it's a failure of SolarWinds, strictly speaking. I think they did some things that they shouldn't have, and probably were lax in certain areas. But I think, I think it points to the bigger issue of we're just not doing due diligence on our side, monitoring these tools.
And I think that brings up an important point here, because when you think about it, we obviously are hyper focused on the SolarWinds hack because it is fresh in our minds. It's only a few months old as of this recording, but this is not the first time that software programs have been hacked, or that database information has been leaked, or really that anything has been compromised. And we're talking about the things that people know about. If you want to rewind the clock all the way back to 2013, when Edward Snowden released a lot of information about things that the NSA and other organizations were doing to backdoor products, to create weak elliptical curve technology for encryption that can be easily reversed. It's not just a question of can we get in? It's a question of we're going to get in to anything we want to get into. And if you're focused on one part of the equation, you're going to miss everything else. It's just like any magician. Don't look at what my left hand is doing. My right hand's doing all the work. It's misdirection. So by hyper focusing on certain tools and taking that stance of, if it gets hacked, we're going to rip it out, are we really just getting into a situation where not only are we not doing any more good than we did in the original harm, but worse yet, what if it's a situation where we specifically want you to install a tool that we know is easier to get into by breaking the harder tool in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. And I think, my personal stance on the SolarWinds hack, by the way, is that I don't think you need to rip out SolarWinds at this point. I think that, look at the Boeing 787 MAX as an example. It's kind of a parallel, right? By the time that plane is back in the air, it's already back in the air now as of when we're recording this, but by the time it's actually sort of pervasive and it's flying everywhere, that is going to arguably be the most safe and scrutinized airplane ever built. I think SolarWinds is doing some serious soul searching, and I think with all of the focus in the industry on this hack, I think they're going to emerge as a much stronger, much more secure solution than they were before, number one. And number two, potentially more secure than a lot of the other tools that are out there that are sitting back looking at SolarWinds going, haha, they got hacked.
Yeah, you've got a good point there, because sometimes it's not what went wrong, but how did you fix it? How did you overcome? And yes, their software will be better. I think we have a real problem right now in the industry with all this agile methodology. Everyone wants to get their product to market so quickly. And then you've got all kinds of developers who have entered into the field. I think, it's inevitable that it's going to happen whether it's just bad software or it's embedded with some sort of threat.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the scrutiny that SolarWinds is getting from the industry is going to force them to put out a better product. I think we need to take that viewpoint from the very beginning of development, security first, and that's not always been the case. And SolarWinds is just as bad as any other company in taking a bunch of products that were developed independently and trying to jam them together. And the Frankensteins of the world that are running around in our software circles, that's where the problems are going to be. It's those interfaces, things that people don't think about anymore. Well, we haven't updated that for 20 years, but it's still there.
You just know somebody is going to try it with another software. Now it's a challenge.
Well, and you've got a couple different threat vectors, right? If you look at who's hacking who. And, the SolarWinds hack, as far as we know, was, a nation state, right? And the big 3 or 4, arguably, nation states, right? From Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, arguably, they're going to get in just like our NSA is going to get in. They're going to get into certain products. They have the power to do it. The individual hackers, the sort of folks that are going out there and trying to do ransomware and this, that, and the other, aren't as well funded. They get into things, but they're not as well funded. To hack something like a SolarWinds takes a very concerted, targeted effort. And that's what this was, right? So when you look at that, this one got discovered. Go look at every other NMS out there that hasn't had scrutiny, that hasn't faced this. How do we know they haven't been hacked already? And it's just not been discovered, right? So I think this knee-jerk rip out and replace with something else, to Tom's kind of original point of like, hey, maybe they're trying to force us to install something, that's easier to deal with. I mean, who knows? I think that's kind of a thing.
Well, not only that, but here's something that you need to consider. If I am a part-time criminal and I'm looking to get some quick cash from using a WannaCry variant to encrypt, I don't know, let's just say Garmin's network, I'm just going to spray it everywhere and hope that I get some money back. But if I'm doing this as a long-term goal, which is historically something that nation-state-backed actors want, they want to penetrate and persist for a significant amount of time to collect information, whether it's for intelligence services or for blackmail or resell later. They're not going to pick targets that are easily discoverable or removable. You think back to movie fans, you think back to the Avengers. Yeah, the Mind Stone is what Thanos wanted, but you couldn't just rip it out of the Vision's forehead. It was integrated into who he was. That makes it difficult. So yeah, I would absolutely target your NMS. I would target your Active Directory installation. I would target anything that is maybe a little more compromisable than just the average tool on a laptop. But it's going to be really difficult for you to disengage that, because so many of your processes are built around these invisible things. And I mean, when you think all the way back to the Latin phrase, who watches the watchers? Well, nobody does. And I like it that way, because even if you do detect this, which it took over almost a year for people to detect that the SolarWinds hack had happened, and some of these have gone even longer, I want you to take as long as it can, because you still can't get rid of it even when you know what's going on.
Yeah, and so many of the advanced persistent threats, they go on for years and years. I'm thinking in terms of the Marriott or hotels one. They go on for years, and they are very difficult to detect because they're exfiltrating information bit by bit by bit. So it's not a big, it's not like they come in brute force and take everything.
It's sort of like the old song from the 40s or 50s where the guy steals a car from the factory one part at a time, and it ends up being a 55, 56, 57. That's the hacker mindset now. They know they're going to make their payday, and the longer they stay in, the bigger that payday is going to be. So it's worth the persistence. It's worth, they're not looking for that big splash. They don't want to be on the news anymore.
Well, and here's a question, I guess, more than a comment. I mean, and that is, the old argument of open source, fully scrutinized versus closed source, only the company can get access to the, keys to the kingdom. I mean, would the SolarWinds hack, and I hate to keep going back to it, but would the SolarWinds hack have happened if the software base was open source? Because there's so much scrutiny. I mean, the first thing that happens with an open source product, besides it gets forked 5 times, is people start scrutinizing the code base. They look for weaknesses. They look for every possible buffer overflow and every possible exploitable avenue into that software, and then it gets fixed. I don't know how much the big NMS packages or anything really. I mean, look at the Exchange hack too. I mean, I don't know how many of the closed source software products have that level of scrutiny internally. In other words, does Microsoft have a red team that's actually actively hacking their code base? I don't know.
So I have a question. Who is the victim here? Is it SolarWinds or is it the 33,000 customers?
Why not both?
Yeah, I would argue both. Reputationally, it's SolarWinds. Actual damage, potentially from an intelligence gathering point of view and whatever, it's the companies. It's the pass through.
But who assumes the liability at that point? Is it SolarWinds for producing what they at the time thought was a valid product and turned out not to be? Or is it the companies who, can maybe now say that their security procedures were not as buttoned up as they thought? I mean, that's one of the things that we're actually starting to see, is that Microsoft's vulnerability to this kind of intrusion is going to end up being a bigger story because of things like the new Exchange hack and a lot of other things going on. SolarWinds may have been the vector, but just like, say, breaking into a military base, do you fire the guards at the gate for letting me in, or do you get the entire security detail of the base on report because I was able to go pretty much wherever I wanted without being stopped? It's a hard question to answer. And we've already seen in the Senate hearings that the companies that were directly involved with it, their initial reaction to it was, well, a nation state hacked us. What were we supposed to do? Which I kind of feel is a little bit of a cop out. But, kind of getting back to the original premise of the episode, does that mean that if a company that immediately knew that they'd been hacked by SolarWinds ripped it out right away, that they can then disclaim liability for getting hacked, even though if you've been using SolarWinds or whatever the hack program happens to be for the 5 or 6 months that we knew it was infected, ripping it out now isn't going to do any good. It's like closing the barn door after the horses have gotten out. So does this attempt to shut everything down and rip it all out, is it really more of an exercise in, I'm going to save my job because I didn't do my due diligence of making sure that my NMS wasn't able to talk to the internet?
Exactly. It's security theater. It's just like, taking our shoes off at the airport after someone has attempted that particular exploit of the system. SolarWinds is going to be around. I don't think it's going anywhere. And people just need to take the lessons from this and learn. You have to secure everything. You trust no one, not even what you would think is a trusted system. So it's, defense in depth, zero security, zero trust security, whatever buzzword you want to use, take it to heart and start implementing it.
Yeah, and I don't know. I didn't follow the 100% the threat vector, the way that they got into the SolarWinds product. I didn't follow that in depth, but my question would be not so much why does the NMS talk to the internet, because there are valid reasons why your NMS would actually need to have access to the internet in general. Well, not in general, but my question is, why don't people have that secured? In other words, why is that traffic path not locked down? Like, SolarWinds needs to talk to this server or these servers or this update service, right? It's like my TV. I've got smart TVs in my house. Well, if you ever put a Wireshark trace on those and look, my TV, and I'm not going to say the brand, I have a personal ongoing problem with this brand, generates a ridiculous amount of traffic to thousands of different addresses constantly trying to update and check this and check that for all the smart software that goes on there and all the little different pieces and things like that. If SolarWinds is doing that, well, shame on them and shame on you for allowing it. If SolarWinds, however, is simply going back to the mothership for certain types of updates, that I think that's a fairly benign activity. You just need to be aware of it. You need to monitor it. You need to have it locked down.
Yeah, and one of the problems, you said we need to know what SolarWinds should have been talking to, what its behavior should be. Well, we've been talking zero trust for about 7 years now. Has anyone accomplished zero trust? No. It's because companies, I have not met with a single customer who understands their application dependencies. They don't know what needs to talk to what. So that's a real problem. And every day, if it's not SolarWinds, it's somebody else. There's a breach on the news. And so if I was the CISO, the first thing I would do is I would make sure I started moving into that zero trust model.
Well, and the real question, Rita, not do the businesses know how their data is going around, but can the businesses ask their application developers, whether that be a SolarWinds, a Microsoft, what does your product actually need to function? And can they get the answer? Because I found more and more when you ask that question, the developers that wrote the software have no clue what that total system really needs to talk. Does it really need to talk on 500 ports between all 3 servers, or is it 1 port between 2 and then another one has to talk on somewhere else? And that is the hardest part about doing zero trust, is finding out what is actually legitimate, especially when you have something that maybe only talks once a quarter on that 1 port, but that's critical to the business.
Well, and how many of us, we probably all of us have been around long enough to remember, all these products that used to have as part of their instructions for deployment, open this port range. Mm-hmm. And it was like, and it was thousands of ports. And that was the instructions, literally open all of these ports. Well, how many of those products still exist? How many products out there, still require you to have, wide open blast radius for, their traffic patterns? And a lot of times when you dig in and ask, they don't, nobody can tell you why that is. Nobody can tell you what's actually happening on any given port. We just need this port range opened, so that's a very large attack surface, and I would be highly suspicious of any product in today's world that still does that.
But so many companies have their legacy systems still in place that, yeah, it really is going to be. I mean, there's so many different vendors out there that sell, ways to do your application dependency mapping. It's just to have a grasp on it. And it's very unfortunate. A lot of companies don't want to make that investment.
Well, and to your point, Rita, I used to work for a defense contractor, and one of the rules that we had, that was part of just, part of the way things had to happen, was the products that we had developed, built, and sold to the military we had to have the original systems still up and operational for the lifetime of that product. So if we had a 30-year-old product that was still in service, this was in the nuclear industry, so it's not uncommon, we had to keep around all of these old like HPUX servers and different things long past the lifetime of those products because that was the rule. And that's not uncommon. So how do you secure those products? I mean, the first thing we did, obviously, was we took them off of being able to communicate outside of our network. But if somebody gets inside our network, or, we have somebody who's authorized to be on our network who's inside, so an insider threat, how do you secure those products? Right. And that's a problem because, it's easy to say we should all be using modern products that follow modern security paradigms, zero trust. We should have, this, that, and the other. But if we're relegated to using some of these older products still, that's tough.
So I guess the biggest question then is, knowing that we have to deal with application developers who don't do a good job of documenting the code, or worse yet, pulling in pieces that they have no idea how it works. It just added a function that we needed. Knowing that we have environments that are completely full of dependencies that we can't remove and dependencies that are old and unable to be secured, because that particular product, the developer that wrote it retired, or that company went out of business, but we can't find something to replicate it. How do we push back and force companies to do better about security, to be more proactive about releasing security updates? How do we essentially vote with our dollar? Do we refuse to implement new things? Do we refuse to pay upkeep and maintenance? Is there a good answer, or are we just kind of stuck with the suck and we have to deal with what we have, and maybe next time we'll do a better job of planning it all out, but in reality we know that we're just going to buy whatever the updated version is because they're going to give us 40% off anyway?
Yeah, we definitely need to get all companies, and to improve their security. And when there's something like SolarWinds, when something's big in the news, to me, that's a time to be talking to companies. When it's top of mind. I remember the pushback on disaster recovery, and then a year we had tons of floods, and so now everybody wanted to talk disaster recovery. So the visibility, I mean, it's a shame it happened, but the visibility, I think it's got a lot of people thinking.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right. The only way to get people talking and thinking secure is for them to be bit. We have, customers that have had massive ransomware attacks, and we've had, other types of threats, and suddenly their security budgets open wide open, and they get security people, they get all sorts of things. But up until that point, it was no, not going to happen, too expensive. We had one business owner who came to us after a major event and basically said, this threatened my business more than any fire, flood, or tornado could have ever done. And I prepare for all those things. I have contingency plans for what if my building disappears. I didn't have a contingency plan for what if my business, my data was gone and I couldn't get to it. And so, I think that type of testimonial among the business community will help.
Yeah, and when you look at the average cost of a threat or a breach, is $3.8 million if it's a Fortune 1000 company. If you look at that, plus the time to clean it up, how it affects the stock market, it's a whole lot more than the 3.8 million. And so when someone's hesitant to spend maybe 200, 400,000 on a solution, they think it's too expensive. Yeah, when they look at the big picture, what this actually cost, and no one's immune to it.
Well, and the other thing too is what I've noticed anyway in the security world, just talking to a lot of different companies, is you've got companies buy into this, and it's their fault, and vendors promote it, and I blame them a little bit more. And that is, here's this product. This product is going to solve your security issues. Buy this product and deploy it. And what they don't do is they don't look at what you were talking about, Rita, which is a zero trust, or whatever methodology we want to talk about, right? They don't buy into a holistic approach to security. They buy into how much does it cost? Here's this thing I can buy. I check the box, we're secure. And that's, where some of these problems come from. I guarantee you a lot of these companies had we've got network monitoring, that box is checked. We've got a firewall, that box is checked. Et cetera, right? And they don't actually look holistically at what needs to be done to truly secure the network.
Yeah, just like, the IPS, IDS appliances, most people will just put them in detection mode, because, as soon as they turn on prevention mode, then traffic that they don't understand quits talking, because it gets stopped. So what do? They just throw it wide open, just leave it in detection mode, and then never pay attention to it.
Yeah, it's the classic IP allow any at the end of a firewall rules statement.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, Rita, that sort of mindset of not turning on IPS or something, it goes back to something that in my customer base, we're dealing with a lot of school districts and other government entities that don't have a lot of budget. Their IT guys are underfunded. They're not as well trained, and they're trying to deal with these very complex things that companies that are, Fortune 500 companies that are fully funded are struggling with, and then they're trying to deal with the same problems. And things like SolarWinds came up, and they're just like, oh, how do I even know if I was hacked? I don't. I can't afford to hire somebody to come in and do the forensics. I can't. So I have to just assume I wasn't, or where do I sit?
And I think maybe that's the point where we've reached, that a lot of it's going to come down to resource availability. Yes, if I had an infinite amount of money and an infinite amount of hours in the day to completely rip everything out and replace it with something that's perfectly architected by people with an infinite amount of resources, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Everything would be 100% secure, and all of our employees would follow every regulation and guideline to the letter, and no one would ever hack us. But the reality is that resource contention is why we are where we are. We never have enough money. We never have enough time. And lack of time and lack of money leads to mistakes that are exploited by people with more time than they need to pull that in to get more money. And that's why we end up where we are. And then we have to make the hard choices. Do we sacrifice time and money shutting something down and rebuilding it from scratch? Or do we save a little bit of those resources and instead sacrifice the potential lost revenue from customers or potential lost revenue from our reputation hit that we take by not shutting something down when we should have? There are no clear-cut answers. And if you don't have a policy in place to deal with these kinds of things when they come up, the answers get much, much more murky. And you're going to have to do some soul searching when that happens, because you'd rather do the soul searching with your team now than deal with the fallout of having to answer a bunch of hard questions from news media and security analysts. That should just about do it for this episode of the On-Premise IT Roundtable. I want to thank our guests for joining us today. If you are interested in more great premises like these, you can always check out our website at gestaltit.com/podcast, where you can find the latest episode. You can also subscribe in your favorite podcast application of choice. Just follow along in Apple Podcasts or any one of a number of applications, including iTunes. And if you do, make sure you leave us a review and a rating. Tell people why they should be listening to the On-Premise IT Roundtable, because that's how we grow the listener audience. And it's how we get great premises like the one that Ben Story came up with for this episode. So for myself, Tom Hollingsworth, and for our great guests, and for everyone who's a part of the Gestalt IT community, I want to thank you very much for tuning in. And please make sure to stay tuned for another great premise headed your way soon.